Wei Yingwu sent to Lidan. We parted last year when the flowers were blooming. Now they bloom again. It's been a year. The currents in our lives are so hard to predict. This spring melancholy stays with me as I fall asleep alone. I've been sick lately and think about going home. My district is full of refugees. I'm ashamed to take my pay. I heard you were thinking about coming for a visit. I've been waiting in the West Tower. How many full moons? So, back to Wei Yingwu, who is one of the silver poets that is relatively well represented in this anthology. I think he has a total of 13 poems. This must be 12, 13. This must be the 10th or so. I think 2 or 3 more are left. Now, Wei Yingwu was traditionally seen as excelling in the old-style pentasyllabic meter, and this is exemplified in this anthology by the fact that 8 of his 12 poems are included in that section, and we read them in a block at the beginning of this series of videos. So, very quick recap on Wei Yingwu. He is a between high and mid Tang poet. He basically started his life serving Emperor Xuanzong just on the eve of the Anlushan rebellion as a bodyguard, but he mainly wrote and mainly produced his poetry in the second half of the 8th century, so 760s, 770s, 780s, and so on. And I think he died at the very end of the 8th, or around the end of the 8th century. Wei Yingwu is traditionally appreciated for his simple, straightforward poetry, and this poem exemplifies it quite well. You know, it's a poem without any deep intertextual references to the past or to figures in the traditions. You know, pretty straightforward statement of feeling and of opinion. He was also believed to excel at natural and retired life type of poetry, and was seen by many as a latter-day Tao Chien. That was the poet that was basically associated with him from the poets of the past. He had a checkered career, but he occupied middle-range posts, both in the central administration and in the provinces. So this poem, Sent to Lidan, I have another volume, not this anthology, but a translation of all of Wei Jingwu's poems, and from there I found a few more pieces of information. So this poem was written in 784 in Chuzhou, which was the prefecture of which Wei Yingwu was the prefect, the governor, in the 780s. This was under the reign of Tedzong, and Emperor Tedzong, this was 30 years after the Anlushan rebellion, but Emperor Tedzong's reign was characterized by an attempt at curbing the power of those military governors, the Yedushi, that since the rebellion had become entrenched in many areas of the country, in Shandong, in parts of the south even, in Huaishi, in parts of the west, in Shu, but mainly in the north and northeast part of the country. So at this time there is a bit of chaos. The emperor has led a campaign against some of those military governors. A rebellion has broken out in the heartland, and the emperor has been forced to flee the capital. Most of the warfare is taking place, well, at least some of the most important one is taking place in the south, in the area of Huaishi, whose governor has rebelled also against the central government. The defeat of the rebellion of Huaishi is going to mark the change in tide towards the strengthening of imperial power that is very characteristic of the mid-Tang period, of the early years of the 9th century. But this is still starting at this time. And Huaishi, that rebel province, was very close to Wei Jingwu's Chuzhou, and was a neighboring province that is referenced in this poem. So this poem is sent to Lidan. In fact, the original title mentions 2 figures, Lidan and Yuan Shi, I think. And they were men who visited Wei Jingwu at different times of the previous year. The city's west tower is mentioned at the end of the poem. This was a tower in the gate that looked towards the capital. The capital, as I said, at the moment this poem was written in 784, was briefly occupied by rebels, by Chutsu. And the refugees that are also mentioned in the poem coming into the prefecture are those coming from Huaishi and from the rebellion of Li Shilie, who was, as I said, the governor of Huaishi. Now, what's the topic of the poem? So, well, on the face of it, the poem is about, you could say, it's about parting or writing to friends who are far away for communicating with them. But it's also pretty clear that this poem also includes other elements that are very relevant to it. A critique of contemporary affairs, basically the chaos, the rebellions, the warfare, is in the background of the poem, and it's clearly stated. The sadness and melancholy of spring, especially of spring away from friends, is referenced. And I think those would be probably the main elements, the main topics and subtopics of the poem. So communicating with friends who are far away, the sadness of spring, being alone and far from friends, and the civil strife and chaos taking place, and the effect, more than a description of that civil strife, some of the effects of that strife and the effects they have on the poetic persona of Wei Yingwu are referenced. So as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. We parted last year when the flowers were blooming. Now they bloom again. It's been a year. So as usual, the first couplet introduces us to the tone and to the story that is going to be told in the poem, especially in a lu shi that has 8 lines and has a little bit of space for narrating something. So the poem starts with a pretty conventional image. Tons of Chinese poems start with a setting in spring where a poetic voice, very often a woman's voice, laments that her lover went away last spring and hasn't come back. And there is this contrast between spring being the season of love in which nature starts showing universal courtship in the blossoms of the trees and the animals getting together, but this contrasts, jars with the loneliness of the woman whose husband or lover is away. So this poem starts by appropriating this imagery, this very typical conventional image. It's spring, flowers are blooming, and a year has passed. We parted in spring, it's spring again. So a year has passed, nature renews itself cyclically, we do not, we get older, and we are separated just as we were separated last spring. Okay, the poem goes on. Second couplet. The currents in our lives are so hard to predict. This spring melancholy stays with me as I fall asleep alone. So the second couplet continues the line of the first one. The first one introduces us to sadness in spring, away from friends. So the second couplet feels like the reflections, the feelings of Wei Yingwu amidst this background of spring sadness and distance from friends. Life is unpredictable, things change. The cycles of nature are predictable, but the affairs of men are not. So the poet is saying, we don't know what the future will bring us. We don't know when or if we will meet again. And the poem continues with spring melancholy. So the poet feels sad, feels this spring melancholy at suffering the contrast of nature getting together, putting the animals and the plants in the season for love and togetherness, while he is far from his friends. He is alone. He hasn't got a mate. Here, the mates are his friends, not a love interest. But he still sleeps alone, forlorn, lonely. Third couplet. So the third couplet continues telling us things about Wei Jingwu. It gets more personal, perhaps, in this line. So instead of the trite conventionalisms about being alone and being sad and life being unpredictable, third couplet becomes much more specific in giving us concrete information about Wei Jingwu and about his times. My district is... I've been sick lately and think about going home. My district is full of refugees. I'm ashamed to take my pay. What is specifically happening in this spring to Wei Yingwu? So first he's been sick. At the time of writing this poem, he's not a young man. He must be at least in his 50s, 60s, I imagine. So pretty old for China at this time. He's been sick. He misses his home. He's far away in the south in the provinces serving. And And there's a greater source of confusion, shame, or embarrassment for the governor. His province is chock full of refugees, which, as we said, were probably coming from the neighboring province of Huaishi, which was rebelling against the central government. So the district is full of refugees, people suffering, people who are suffering hunger and cold and misery. And a Confucian scholar like Wei Yingwu feels, ashamed of living in relative ease while he's surrounded by so much poverty and destitution. Finally, the last couplet moves out from Wei Jingwu's current condition and feelings, and it joins us back with the persons who were to receive this poem, the receivers of the poem. I heard you were thinking about coming for a visit. I've been waiting in the West Tower. How many full moons? So the poem ends on a pretty conventional take again, just as the beginning was conventional, the ending is pretty conventional. But it is to be expected in a poem sent to friends. And, the last line says, I've heard rumors that you're coming, and I've been waiting so long for you to come. And, whether it's sincere or not, he paints himself on the top of the West Tower leading to the capital, night after night, looking to the northwest and hoping to see his friends come. So, okay, so not a bad poem. I especially like the parts of it that are less than conventional and that focus on the actual current predicaments of China and of Wei Jingwu in 784, as opposed to the more generic and conventional statements of missing friends and of being sad in spring. Altogether, not a bad poem, not a bad poem.